You know, usually when we look at an ancient text, a foundational religious or philosophical document, there's this overwhelming expectation of, well, poetry.
Right. We expect it to be deeply poetic.
Exactly. Like, imagine standing in a centuries-old cathedral. You look up at the intricate stained glass, you see the light filtering through the dust motes in the air, and you're just meant to feel something, you know?
Yeah, you're meant to feel completely overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated mystery of it all. It's designed to be a visceral experience.
Right.
The architecture itself is meant to dwarf you, to make you feel small in the face of the infinite.
Yeah, you don't walk into a cathedral, track down the bishop, and start demanding to see, like, the load-bearing calculations for the flying buttresses.
No, of course not. You don't ask about the tensile strength of the mortar.
You just accept the awe. You just let the mysticism wash over you.
And historically, I mean, human beings find that incredibly comforting.
We really do.
We actually prefer to place the divine, or, the ultimate truth of the universe, into this sealed box of unknowable mystical radiance.
Because if the truth is just a magical, glowing mystery, it requires absolutely zero practical structural work from us.
Exactly. We just get to sit there and admire it.
But then you step into the specific source material we are looking at today for this deep dive, and the entire paradigm violently shifts.
It really does. It's jarring.
Suddenly, somebody walks in, turns the fluorescent house lights on in the cathedral, hands you a hard hat, and just unrolls a massive, highly technical engineering schematic right across the altar.
The mysticism is just gone.
Gone. We're looking at a landscape that is entirely devoid of that poetic fog.
Because it is the absolute definition of a functional systems-level blueprint.
Yeah.
And that framework is vital to understand before we go any further into the text today.
Which is why we're establishing it right out of the gate.
Right, because if we don't adopt the analytical, structural mindset of a systems engineer right now, we will completely miss what this source is trying to reveal to us.
We'll end up just staring at the stained glass, completely missing the fact that the building is fundamentally a machine.
So let's get into the specifics.
Right. So the source we are unpacking today is a foundational 1977 lecture series, specifically Lecture 6, to be exact.
Delivered by the renowned scholar Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Yes, and this is preserved in the Tolu-e-Islam digital audio archives. Now, the lecture focuses heavily on a specific chapter of the Quran, Surah An-Nur, and zeroes in on verses 32 through 35.
And the verse 35 is just famous worldwide.
It really is. It's known as the Ayat An-Nur, or the light verse.
Right.
The opening Arabic phrasing is incredibly well known, even if you don't speak the language. Allahu nuru as-samawati wal ard. God is the light of the heavens and the earth.
And if you look at the last 1,000 years of human history, that single sentence is arguably the most quoted, most mystically interpreted text in existence.
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, it has spawned centuries of intricate Sufi poetry, massive philosophical treatises, and just countless pieces of devotional art.
All of them attempting to portray God's unknowable, glowing transcendence.
Right. It has become the ultimate symbol of the ethereal.
Which is exactly where our source material from 1977 brings down the hammer.
It really does. Parwez's lecture cuts straight through a millennium of that mystical sentimentality.
And the premise established here is incredibly jarring if you've grown up with the poetry.
Oh, it completely upends it.
The light verse, according to the socio-economic reading, is not a poem about God's glowing transcendence.
No. It is a highly sophisticated functional engineering diagram.
It literally describes how the divine rational order is amplified, directed, and sustained through correct social architecture.
The lecture argues that reading it as a poem fundamentally breaks the internal logic of the text.
Right, because of where it's placed.
Exactly. It uses the structural placement of the verses to prove this mechanical reading.
I mean, think about how a schematic works.
You don't get the diagram for the engine's power output without first getting the diagrams for the pistons, the fuel lines, and the exhaust.
So if verse 35 was just a standalone mystical poem about how glowing and beautiful God is...
It could have been placed anywhere in the text. Literally anywhere.
But it isn't. To understand what this light actually is, the source argues, we have to look at the engine that is being painstakingly built in the verses immediately preceding it.
And that's where the deep dive really begins today.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I was looking at that exact structural curiosity in the lecture notes, and it genuinely threw me.
Surprising, right?
Very. The lecture starts its analysis at verse 24.32, which is just a few lines before the cosmic light verse, and verse 32 is... well, it's basically municipal economics.
Yeah, it is. It's a command for a society to facilitate marriage.
And I found myself asking, why does a supposedly cosmic, mystical verse about the universal light of God immediately follow incredibly mundane socio-economic commands?
It feels like a complete non sequitur
Right.
if you're reading it through the lens of mysticism.
It makes no sense. It would be like reading a dense legal manual on urban zoning laws, taxation, property lines.
Right, just dry municipal code.
And then suddenly, right in the middle of a paragraph about public utilities, finding a sweeping romantic stanza from John Milton about the light of heaven.
Right, it just doesn't fit. But as a manual for civilisational systems engineering.
The sequence is actually flawless.
It is. So walk me through that sequence. What exactly is verse 32 demanding?
Okay, so the Arabic text says, "Wa'ankihu alayama minkum wa asalihina mini batikum wa imaikum."
Which is a direct command to the collective society.
Exactly, to facilitate the marriage of the unmarried ones among them, including the widows, the widowers, and even the enslaved populations, which, by the way, we will get to in a minute.
Right, that's a massive piece of the puzzle.
But then it includes this critical socioeconomic clause. In yakunu fuqara yuknihi Allahu min fadlihi.
If they are poor, God will enrich them from his bounty.
Now, in the functional framework Parwez is establishing in the 1977 lecture, God's bounty isn't like magic money falling from the sky?
No, not at all. The divine system acts through the state or the collective society itself.
Meaning the state is literally on the hook for the bill.
Precisely. The host of the lecture emphasizes that this isn't just a polite suggestion for rich people to throw nice weddings for their poorer neighbors.
Right.
It's a structural mandate for the systemic eradication of social isolation and economic desperation.
In a properly engineered society, no individual should ever be structurally abandoned.
Regardless of their actual family status, no one should be left utterly alone, unable to form a family unit because of economic bottlenecks.
I mean, think about the sheer scale of that requirement, especially when you look at a modern society today.
It's staggering.
We are currently facing unprecedented epidemics of loneliness.
We really are.
The economic barriers to family formation are absolutely astronomical right now. You have housing costs, rampant inflation, stagnant wages.
Yeah, we see millions of people putting off marriage and families simply because they literally cannot afford the baseline cost of existence.
Let alone supporting dependents.
Exactly. And how does a society usually respond to that?
Oh, in a capitalist framework, the burden is placed entirely on the individual.
Right. The message is always work harder, get a second job, figure it out.
But this 1977 source points out that humans are fundamentally biological social creatures.
Forming a family, having a stable social unit, it isn't a luxury.
No, it is the foundational building block of civilisational stability.
And the text mandates that the state, the collective society, must physically and economically intervene to support these unions.
If your young people cannot afford to marry, your economic system is broken.
And it is a civilizational obligation to fix the macroeconomy so that they can.
I want to dig into the pushback the lecture addresses here because there's a heavy, very specific critique of what the source calls the state of emergency argument.
Oh yeah, this part is brilliant.
The lecture brings up commentators like Allama G.A, who, for those who don't know, was a massive figure in Islamic political thought.
Right, very influential.
And Maududi looked at these economic barriers and tried to apply a traditional principle of Islamic jurisprudence called idtirar, or necessity.
Right. So the classic example of idtirar is a person starving to death in the desert.
Right, literally dying.
If you are dying of hunger, and the only thing you can find is the meat of a dead animal, which is strictly forbidden under normal circumstances, the law of necessity kicks in.
You are legally permitted, even required, to eat that forbidden food to save your life.
Exactly. It's a biological emergency.
So Maududi extrapolated that logic. He essentially argued that if a society is failing its people economically,
And young people simply cannot afford to get married.
they enter a state of what he called a sexual emergency.
Right. And therefore, according to Maududi's logic, this creates a temporary legal loophole for illicit behavior or temporary informal arrangements.
Because the biological drive is overwhelming.
And the 1977 lecture completely dismantles that analogy.
Absolutely destroys it.
It tears it down to the studs using basic biology.
Yeah, walk me through that.
Well, it points out a fundamental physiological reality. Hunger is an automatic, involuntary mechanism.
You cannot consciously instruct your stomach to stop requiring caloric intake.
Right. If you ignore biological hunger, the result is objectively fatal. Your organs will shut down and you will die.
Therefore, the emergency loophole for starving in the desert is logically and scientifically sound.
But the sexual drive, no matter how powerful or psychologically distracting it is not biologically fatal if unmet.
Right. No one has ever spontaneously died of a lack of physical intimacy.
Exactly. It just doesn't happen. And because it is not fatal, the source text insists on a completely different systemic protocol for this specific socioeconomic failure.
Instead of offering a loophole that degrades the social fabric,
Verse 33 introduces the concept of wayastafif.
which usually translates to chastity. Right.
It does. But in this specific structural context, Parwez argues it means profound, disciplined self-control.
So,
Yeah.
the burden shifts back to the individual.
Only temporarily, and that's the genius of the system.
Oh, I see.
The individual is required to exercise rigorous self-control while the state fulfills its obligation to rebuild the economic capacity for them to marry.
The two-way street.
Exactly. There are no systemic loopholes for social decay.
The system demands personal discipline from the citizen, but it equally demands that the state frantically work to fix the economic bottleneck causing the delay.
You don't lower the moral standard of the society. You raise the economic floor.
Okay, I love this analogy of the society as an engine. You can't pour premium fuel into an engine where the pistons are shattered and expect it to produce horsepower.
Wait, it'll just blow up.
Fixing the economic barriers to marriage, ensuring people aren't isolated, that's just one gear in this massive machine.
But the lecture points out that to build the ultimate container for this light, the architects of this society also had to look at the darkest, most fundamentally broken parts of human interaction.
Yeah, they had to systematically dismantle human exploitation.
Which brings us to arguably the most radical stage of this blueprint, the verses addressing the existing institution of slavery.
We really have to remember the context here.
We do. The ancient world, Rome, Greece, Persia, 7th century Arabia, it ran entirely on the labor of enslaved people.
It's the electricity of the ancient economy.
Literally. You couldn't just flip a switch and turn it off without causing complete civilizational collapse and mass starvation.
But the lecture is categorical about the text's goal, the absolute total eradication of the old order.
The source states that the Quranic text effectively closed the door on taking any new slaves.
Even strictly regulating the status of prisoners of war.
Right. But more importantly, it instituted a massive, systemic, state-funded method to free the existing enslaved population.
And this is where we see the stark difference between theoretical moral philosophy and actual systems engineering.
Oh, yeah. Moral philosophy stands at a podium and says, slavery is a moral evil. Try to be exceptionally kind to your enslaved workers.
Right, which historically hasn't worked out very well.
Not at all.
Yep.
Systems engineering, on the other hand, looks at the macroeconomy and says, here is the exact legal, financial, and sociological mechanism to permanently dismantle the institution of forced servitude.
Without collapsing the broader supply chain.
Precisely.
I was fascinated by the specific mechanism the lecture details. The mukataba, or the deed of freedom.
It's incredibly elegant.
It really is. This wasn't just a suggestion that a slave could, politely ask for freedom.
No, the 1977 lecture breaks down the strict legal mandate.
Right. If an enslaved person asked for a deed of freedom and they had the capacity to work and integrate into society, the society must legally grant that deed.
It was not optional for the person holding them.
But the real engineering marvel isn't just the legal mandate to free them.
No, because history is full of emancipations that went terribly wrong.
Right. If you look at historical abolition, like, say, in post-Civil War America.
Freeing enslaved people without providing them any capital just led directly into a new form of economic indentured servitude.
Sharecropping.
Exactly.
Okay.
They were legally recognized as free, but because they had zero assets, they were economically forced right back to working for their former captors for starvation wages.
They were trapped all over again.
It's the classic problem of being freed from the cage, but having absolutely no food in the forest.
So how does the blueprint we're discussing solve this?
The text explicitly mandates that society must give these newly freed individuals seed money to start their lives.
They must be given a portion of wealth to establish themselves in the free market.
Yes.
It's basically a universal basic income law.
It really is.
But one laser-targeted to transition an entire underclass out of indentured servitude?
It shifts them from being exploited laborers to being active, capital-holding consumers in the free market.
And What blew my mind when reading the source was that this wasn't left to individual charity.
No, the lecturer points out it's a direct state directive.
The public treasury itself, the collective wealth of the society, including taxes collected, is actively mobilized to ensure this transition happens.
The exploitative class is legally mandated to fund the liberation of its own exploited class through the societal taxation system.
Wow. It effectively starves the old exploitative societal engine of its fuel supply.
You are forcibly dismantling the economic incentive to own another human being.
The lecture also ties this into the prohibition of forcing enslaved women into prostitution, which was a massive, horrific industry in the ancient world.
It was huge. And by outlawing the forced prostitution of enslaved women, you instantly cut off a massive, highly lucrative revenue stream for the exploitative class.
You attack the institution of slavery on its moral front, its labor front, and its capital generation front simultaneously.
It is a highly coordinated, systemic takedown.
Okay, so let's pull back for a second and look at what we've built.
So let's do it.
Because I can imagine someone listening and thinking, why are we spending so much time deep diving into marriage economics and historical abolition in an episode that's supposed to be about a beautiful mystical verse about divine light?
It's a fair question.
But it's because, as the 1977 lecture vehemently argues, this socio-economic architecture is the prerequisite for the light.
Exactly. Earlier in Surah An-Nur, the text laid down strict penal laws, flogging for specific crimes.
Brutal evidentiary requirements to prevent false accusations and slander.
Incredibly strict protocols for domestic privacy.
Then it coupled those legal boundaries with this marriage facilitation economy and the systemic abolition of human exploitation.
And by doing all of this, the society has accomplished something monumental.
They have built the physical infrastructure.
They have built the mishkat.
Precisely. They have constructed the niche.
Only now, with the container fully engineered and structurally sound, does the text finally introduce to the light.
Which brings us to verse 24.35, the Ayat An-Nur.
Here we go.
We are moving from the superstitious poetry that has dominated this verse for centuries into the pure systemic design that the lecture maps out.
And it maps it out perfectly.
The text lays out 5 distinct physical elements in a very specific nested order.
The niche, the lamp, the glass, the olive tree, and the oil.
I want to walk through this like a master engineer reading a schematic because the physics of this metaphor are stunning.
Let's view this as a cascading amplification system.
Okay.
The first element is the mishkat, the niche.
Now, in a traditional ancient home, a niche isn't just a decorative shelf.
No, it's a recess built directly into the thick masonry of the wall where you place a light source.
Right. It serves a highly functional purpose.
It does 2 things. First, it protects the flame from the wind.
From the external chaos of the environment that would otherwise blow it out.
Exactly. Second, because of its concave shape, it directs the light outward into the room, rather than letting it scatter aimlessly in 360 degrees.
And the lecture explicitly connects this physical masonry to the social code we just spent so much time discussing.
The laws, the privacy protocols, the economic safety nets, the eradication of exploitation, they are the mishkat.
A society without a just legal code is like a candle sitting out in the middle of a hurricane.
Any light of reason or justice is instantly extinguished by the chaos.
So you have this highly protected, structurally sound niche.
Yes. And placed inside that niche is the second element, the mizbah, the lamp.
The light source itself.
In the source's framework, this lamp represents the divine rational order.
It is the objective truth of the text, the core operating system of justice and equity.
But a bare lamp sitting in a niche only provides baseline illumination. It lights up the immediate area, but it doesn't travel.
For a civilisational system to work, it needs massive amplification.
Enter the third element, the zujaja, the glass globe that surrounds the lamp.
And the text describes this glass in a very specific way. It says the glass is like a brilliant star, kana kakabunduryun.
Think about the actual physics of optics here.
What does a pristine, perfectly crafted glass globe do to a bare flame?
Well, yes, it has a secondary layer of protection, but fundamentally, it refracts and focuses the light,
It takes the scattered photons and multiplies their intensity.
projecting the beam significantly further without actually consuming any more of the fuel source.
The glass is the society itself.
Exactly. A society that properly and rigorously implements the divine rational order acts as this glass.
The citizens, through their daily adherence to equity and justice, amplify the rational principles.
The society becomes a lens that focuses the light so intensely that it shines like a brilliant star for the rest of human civilization to see and navigate by.
That is a phenomenal metaphor.
It's incredible engineering.
But even a protected, amplified lamp needs fuel. A flame cannot burn on nothing.
Right.
The verse specifies that this land is lit by oil from a blessed olive tree. And here's the phrase that Parwez hones in on in the 1977 lecture.
The text describes this tree as neither eastern nor western, la sharqiyatin wala garbiyatin.
Which is a profound statement of universal principle.
If you look at this purely as botany, an olive tree that gets sun from both the east and the west produces the purest oil.
But in the context of civilisational systems engineering,
Neither eastern nor western means this rational social order has no civilizational patent.
right,
It doesn't belong exclusively to the mystics of the East, and it doesn't belong exclusively to the philosophers of the West.
it's open source code.
Yes, it is an objective, universal blueprint available to any facet of humanity willing to download it and implement the architecture.
It completely transcends geography, race, and tribalism. The truth isn't regional.
But the code has to be flawless to run efficiently, which brings us to the most fascinating physical description in the verse.
The thermodynamics of the oil itself.
The text says its oil almost gives light without fire touching it. Yakadu zaituhaha yudu wala lam tamsashanar.
Now, if you were a 12th century poet, that sounds like magical, glowing, supernatural oil. Sure. But practically, mechanically, what is this describing in a society?
The source analyzes this as a brilliant description of self-sustaining momentum.
Okay.
When you engineer a social order perfectly, when the economics are truly balanced, when human exploitation is legally and functionally choked out.
When the justice system is perfectly equitable and transparent.
Exactly. The society generates its own internal momentum. The friction drops to zero
It almost runs itself.
without fire touching it.
Huh.
It means the system doesn't require constant, violent external force to keep it functioning.
You don't need constant political revolutions.
You don't need dictatorial coercion. You don't need the secret police dragging people out of their beds to maintain order.
The system's own frictionless, equitable design naturally produces the energy required to sustain it.
The justice itself fuels the peace.
And the end result of all these perfectly nested, flawlessly engineered components.
The verse concludes the entire metaphor with a famous three-word phrase, Nurun ala nur, light upon light.
This is the cascade effect. Every single layer of this social architecture amplifies the previous one.
The just economy amplifies the strong family units.
The strong family units amplify the societal stability.
The societal stability amplifies the intellectual and scientific output of the society.
Light upon light. It is a compounding return on civilisational investment.
It acts like a perfectly balanced biological ecosystem where every organism's byproduct is another organism's vital nutrient.
A compounding return on civilisational investment. I love that phrasing. But I have to push back here.
Okay, pushback.
Because we've engineered this beautiful societal machine, but we haven't actually addressed the opening line of the verse itself.
The line that kicks off all the centuries of poetry.
Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth.
Right.
If we are being strictly mechanical and sociological, how does the 1977 lecture deal with that? Doesn't that literal translation force us right back into the cathedral with the mysticism?
It's the obvious trap. And the source material tackles it head-on by cross-referencing the Quran's own internal logic.
What do you mean?
The lecture points out that elsewhere, the text explicitly and unequivocally states, nothing is like him, leisa kamithlihi shay.
Right, you can't compare the infinite to the finite.
Exactly. The ultimate divine reality, the creator, is entirely outside the bounds of human sensory comprehension or physical measurement.
Okay.
Therefore, by the text's own established rules, God cannot literally, physically be light.
Because what is physical light? It is a created, measurable, finite phenomenon.
It consists of photons. It operates within the parameters of the electromagnetic spectrum. It has a speed limit.
Right.
If nothing is like him, then he is not a photon. He is not an electromagnetic wave.
Right, so centuries of the translation are just fundamentally flawed.
The 1977 lecture argues that interpreting it literally is a massive linguistic error.
It is a functional analogy for human comprehension, not a literal theological description of God's physical body.
Linguistically, the source argues the Arabic phrasing translates much more accurately to God being the provider of the light.
the source of the guidance for the heavens and the earth.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Just as the physical sun provides physical light so we can navigate the physical terrain of the earth without walking off a cliff.
The divine order provides the intellectual and social light so we can navigate the complexities of building a civilization without destroying ourselves.
The entire metaphor is strictly functional.
It's not about what God looks like, it's about how the system operates.
So if the light isn't a magical glow, but rather this compounding cascade of a perfectly engineered society.
How does a community actually acquire it?
Yeah. Is this blueprint just handed out randomly? Does the universe just arbitrarily choose a specific society to be the city on a hill?
That question leads us directly into the exploration of the law of requital, or mukafati amal.
Because immediately following the light upon light description, verse 35 concludes with, God guides to his light whom he wills, yadi Allahu li nurhi man yasha.
And historically, whom he wills has been interpreted as exactly that, a divine cosmic lottery.
God looks down, arbitrarily picks a group of people, or, a specific mystic meditating in a cave.
And simply zaps them with enlightenment while ignoring everyone else.
But the 1977 lecture completely rejects that arbitrary lottery-based interpretation.
In the systemic, algorithmic framework of this text, whom he wills, does not mean mystical election or divine favoritism.
In Quranic usage, divine will tracks divine law. It is an if-then systemic protocol.
It is cause and effect.
If X, then Y.
Yes. If a society constructs the precise conditions for the Nur,
If they do the grueling work of building the mishkat of social justice,
if they maintain the lamp of rational law,
if they keep the oil of their economy pure from the friction of exploitation,
then they get the Nur.
the guidance isn't a mystical download injected into someone's brain.
No, it is the natural, inevitable output of the correct architecture.
The community that builds An-Nur's social code is the community that is guided to the light.
So the architecture is the guidance.
Think about how empowering, yet terrifyingly responsible that is.
It's massive.
If you build the engine exactly to the specifications of the blueprint, the engine runs. It produces horsepower.
God's will, in this context, is just the objective law of physics that allows combustion to happen once the engine is built right.
It's not arbitrary.
But the flip side is brutal. If you don't build the engine, you don't get the horsepower.
You don't get the light. No amount of praying will make a pile of unassorted metal parts drive you down the highway.
The lecture uses some beautiful analogies from the natural world to illustrate how this guidance functions differently for humans compared to the rest of the universe.
Yeah, in nature, guidance is built in. It's entirely instinctive.
Right. The lecture gives the example of a duckling.
A duckling hatching from an egg doesn't need a prophet to come preach to it.
It doesn't need a school, a teacher, or a textbook.
It breaks out of the shell and instinctively, immediately knows to waddle toward the water and swim.
Or look at a bee. A bee can fly miles away from its hive, navigate incredibly complex terrain.
Find pollen, and flawlessly return to the exact same spot without road signs, maps, or a GPS system.
Nature is pre-programmed with its own built-in instinctive guidance. It operates on a perfectly automatic protocol.
But humans are the anomaly.
We really are.
We don't have a built-in instinct for how to build a macroeconomy.
We don't instinctively know how to write an equitable legal system or how to manage inflation.
If you leave a group of humans alone on an island, they don't automatically build the mishkat.
More often than not, they build brutal hierarchies of exploitation where the strong subjugate the weak.
Precisely. Because humans possess free will, complex intellect, and the capacity for greed, we require objective external guidance.
We aren't pre-programmed bees. We need the blueprint handed to us.
We have to consciously, deliberately, and painstakingly build our societal hive.
The text provides the schematic, the external guidance, but we have to do the heavy manual labor of actually cutting the stone and mixing the mortar.
But what happens when humans get their hands on this incredibly sophisticated civilisational blueprint? And instead of picking up a hammer and building the engine,
They frame the blueprint, hang it on the wall of the cathedral, and start worshiping the paper it's printed on.
that is the ultimate civilisational tragedy.
And it brings us to a part of the lecture that requires absolute sociological precision.
The 1977 source tackles this head-on, the tragedy of mysticism.
The historical failure of communities to actually build the hive.
Or, as the lecture vividly frames it, using a brilliant metaphor from Maulana Rumi, eating the bones and throwing away the marrow.
The lecture takes a very sharp sociological pivot here, aiming a heavy structural critique at a specific philosophy known as Wadat al-Wujud.
Which translates roughly to the unity of being.
Right. This was a dominant, incredibly influential Sufi philosophy championed by historical giants like Ibn Arabi in his Fusus al-Hikam,
And famously embodied by figures like Mansur Hallaj.
who was executed for declaring Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, meaning I am God.
The core premise of Wadat al-Wujud is that everything in existence is literally God.
There is no actual separation between the creator and the created universe. The universe is just an emanation, a reflection.
It is all one continuous, undivided divine presence.
And to a poet, to the average person struggling through a difficult life, that sounds incredibly profound and comforting.
Oh, absolutely. I am one with the universe is God, therefore I am a piece of God. It feels deeply spiritual.
But the 1977 lecture looks at this through the cold, hard lens of systems engineering and says, this is a fatal logical fallacy that will destroy your society.
Because think about the practical implications.
If everything is God, if the human citizen walking down the street is God, if the criminal breaking into a house is God,
and if the judge sitting in the courtroom is God,
then the entire concept of the socio-economic legal system instantly collapses into absurdity.
wait, if the criminal and the judge are both God, how does a courtroom even function? Who is punishing whom and for what?
It doesn't function. That's the whole point. The system requires clear distinction to operate.
If everyone and everything is the divine, there is no objective higher authority left to give commands, and no distinct subjects left to obey them.
There is no objective standard of justice because the violent exploiter and the helpless exploited are essentially just the same divine entity experiencing different states of illusion.
The lecture argues that this philosophy fundamentally paralyzes a society's drive for justice.
It removes the mandate to build the mishkat.
Because the mishkat, the lamp, the darkness, the poverty, the wealth, they're all considered illusions, masking the single divine reality.
Why fight to end slavery if the slave and the master are both just manifestations of the divine one?
It breeds profound societal apathy.
It really does. The lecture also points this critique at more modern sectarian debates, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, it specifically references the endless, exhausting arguments, like those found in the Burrell v. Sec, according to the source, over the physical, metaphysical nature of the prophet.
Spending immense amounts of time, energy, and ink debating whether he was made of literal, physical, glowing light from the heavens, or if he was made of biological human flesh.
And from the perspective of a systems engineer reading a blueprint, this is the ultimate catastrophic distraction.
It's entirely missing the point of the text.
It's like arguing over what color shirt the architect was wearing while your building is actively collapsing on top of you.
The source highlights an incredible, almost tragic irony in the sociological behavior of communities that fall into this trap.
Yes, the phenomenon of grave offerings.
The lecture notes how, instead of utilizing the blueprint to build the social architecture required to eradicate poverty and hunger, communities descended into superstitious rituals.
You have people who are themselves deeply impoverished, who can barely afford to feed their own children.
Taking luxury foods, biryani, sweets, ice cream, roasted meats, and offering them to the stone graves of dead saints.
And why do they do that? Sociologically, it is a psychological coping mechanism.
It is the ultimate abandonment of the cause and effect law of requital.
They are trying to extract the Nur, the light of guidance, prosperity, and relief through ritualistic magic rather than through the grueling work of socio-economic engineering.
Because building an equitable economy is hard. Leaving a plate of rice at a shrine is easy.
Which brings us to that profound quote from Maulana Rumi that the 1977 lecture cites to perfectly encapsulate this tragedy.
Rumi observed that later generations took the literal words of the text, the beautiful Arabic verses, and treated them like bones.
They threw the bones to the dogs, meaning they focused entirely on the superficial, outward recital,
The melodic pronunciation and the superstitious dogmas.
while completely ignoring and discarding the actual marrow.
And the marrow is the rational, systemic, functional core of the text.
They kept the poetry and threw away the engineering.
If we synthesize all of this, we finally see what the 1977 lecture is arguing about the master structure of Surah An-Nur itself.
Verse 24.35, the light verse, isn't just randomly placed after the marriage laws and the slavery abolition laws.
No, it is placed at the exact mathematical center of the surah.
It is the absolute thesis statement of the entire text.
It forms the bridge. It's the keystone of the verse.
Yes. It bridges the preceding, highly practical social provisions, the construction of the mishkat, with the subsequent verses in the chapter that promise human stewardship, the Khilafah, and immense prosperity over the earth.
It is a bold civilisational declaration of permanence and change.
The divine principles, the light, the objective truth, these are permanent.
But the society must constantly work, change, adapt, and engineer its physical architecture to align with those principles as time moves forward.
We have covered massive, complex ground today. Let's trace the arc of this journey to really cement how revolutionary this 1977 source material is.
We started by walking into the cathedral, looking up at the famous light verse, 24.35, and we actively shed the false assumption that it's just a beautiful poem about a mystical, glowing deity.
We moved from passive, awestruck mysticism to active, responsible systems engineering.
We saw how the verses preceding the light verse lay out the strict, uncompromising requirements for building the mishkat, the protective container.
This isn't spiritual metaphor. It involves a state-sponsored economy that actively facilitates family formation and structurally eradicates social isolation.
It demands the systematic, funded abolition of slavery and human exploitation.
It legally forces the exploitative class to fund the emancipation of their victims, effectively starving the old engine of its fuel.
Only when their precise socio-economic container is built, only when the physics of the society are sound, can the lamp of divine rational order be lit.
We learned that this system acts as a cascading optical amplifier light upon light generating its own frictionless, self-sustaining momentum.
And critically, this light isn't a magical grace bestowed upon a lucky, chosen few by divine lottery.
Neither Eastern nor Western.
Exactly. It is an open source, universally amplifiable principle, accessible to any community, anywhere on the planet, that is willing to do the hard, practical work of building a just, economically sound, and exploitation-free society.
The architecture itself is the guidance.
But the warning is equally clear. If a society abandons the engineering for the poetry,
If it embraces the comforting fallacy that everything is God, or spends its intellectual energy debating the metaphysical composition of ancient prophets while ignoring the starving poor in its own streets,
it throws away the marrow and is left chewing on dry bones.
it results in a stagnant society that desperately hopes for magical intervention while its actual physical and economic institutions rot from the inside out.
Which brings us to a final, echoing thought to mull over as you step back into the real world.
Look out at modern society right now. Look at our failing institutions.
Look at the massive, widening economic disparities, the housing crises, the loneliness epidemics.
Look at the sheer ideological confusion that is actively paralyzing so many nations.
We spend all of our time on cable news networks, in parliaments, endlessly scrolling on social media, debating the mystical meaning of our foundational ideals.
We argue endlessly over the political poetry of our ancestors. We fight with the ghosts of our founders over what they meant.
We argue about what the light means rather than doing the work to learn how the light is actually produced.
But this 1977 source material, this deep dive into Surah An-Nur, leaves us with a stark, terrifyingly practical challenge.
Are our modern societies failing simply because we are standing out in the middle of a hurricane trying to light a match in the wind without ever bothering to build a mishkat?
We demand the light of justice, but we refuse to lay the bricks of equity.
The message of the text is ruthless in its pragmatism. Build the architecture, and the light takes care of itself. Debate the light, and you will remain forever in the dark.
It completely reframes how we must look at any foundational document. Is it a painting to be admired from afar, or is it a schematic demanding to be executed?
You can't live inside a painting. You have to build the cathedral.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope this has equipped you to look past the poetry and keep questioning the architecture of the world around you. Until next time, keep digging and keep building.